Canada is the second largest country on Earth, and much of it is still covered by mountains, forests, frozen lakes, and huge areas of wilderness where almost nobody lives. But hidden inside these remote landscapes are places that tell a very different story. Empty houses stand beside roads that no longer lead anywhere. Rusting machines sit quietly in forests. Old mines disappear into mountainsides, while entire communities that once had families, schools, stores, and busy streets have almost vanished from the map. Some of these places were abandoned when mines closed. Others died when the industries supporting them disappeared. And in some cases, people left so quickly that it feels as if the town was built, lived in, and forgotten almost overnight. What makes these places fascinating is that nature never stops moving. Trees grow through foundations, rain destroys roofs, snow covers abandoned roads, and every year another piece of history disappears. Today, we're exploring 7 forgotten places hidden in Canada's remote wilderness, starting with a town that had almost everything a modern community could need, but survived for only a very short time. Number 7 is Kitsault, British Columbia. Hidden among the mountains of northern British Columbia is a town that feels like someone built an entire community and then suddenly changed their mind. Its name is Kitsault, and unlike many old ghost towns, Kitsault is surprisingly modern. The town was created in the late 1970s and early 1980s to support workers at a nearby molybdenum mine. Molybdenum is a metal commonly used to make steel stronger, and when demand for it was high, developing a mining community in this isolated part of British Columbia seemed like a good idea. Kitsault was not supposed to be a temporary collection of rough mining cabins. It was designed as a real community where workers could bring their families and live comfortably. Apartment buildings and houses were constructed, along with a shopping center, recreational facilities, roads, and other services. Hundreds of residents arrived, and for a brief period, Kitsault looked like a town with a long future ahead of it. Then the market changed. The price of molybdenum dropped sharply, and the mine was no longer profitable enough to keep operating. In 1982, after the community had been occupied for only about 18 months, the mine shut down. Without the mine, there was almost no reason for the town to exist. Families packed their belongings, workers moved away, and Kitsault became nearly empty almost as quickly as it had been created. That short life is what makes the place so unusual. Most ghost towns slowly lose their population over decades, but Kitsault went from a new community to an almost abandoned one in less time than many people spend at a single job. Kitsault was later purchased by a private owner and has been maintained, so it should not be treated as an open abandoned site that anyone can freely enter. Number 6 is Anyox, British Columbia. Farther into the remote landscape of British Columbia lies a very different abandoned community. Anyox was once a noisy industrial town filled with miners, families, ships, machinery, and smoke. Today, the silence is almost complete. Anyox developed during the early 20th century after rich copper deposits were discovered in the region. Its isolated location made building a community difficult, but the value of the copper made the effort worthwhile. Mining operations expanded, a large smelter was constructed, and thousands of people eventually lived in the settlement. At its peak, Anyox had many of the things you would expect in a normal town: homes, stores, community buildings, and facilities for workers and their families. But almost everything depended on one thing: the mine. If copper continued to bring money, Anyox could survive. If it didn't, there were few other reasons for thousands of people to remain in such an isolated location. For years, the mines and smelter kept Anyox alive, but the community faced serious problems. The mining operation damaged the surrounding environment, and the industrial landscape around the town became heavily affected by pollution from the smelter. Economic problems eventually became even more important. During the 1930s, copper prices were low and keeping the operation profitable became increasingly difficult. Mining finally ended, workers lost their reason to remain, and the population disappeared. Nature then began the much slower process of taking the place back. Buildings deteriorated, industrial equipment rusted, and vegetation returned around the ruins. What makes Anyox especially haunting is its scale. This was not one lonely cabin in the woods. It was an industrial community where thousands of people once depended on enormous machines and mining operations for their daily lives. Number 5 is Bankhead, Alberta. Our next forgotten place is hidden inside one of the most famous landscapes in Canada. Millions of visitors come to Banff National Park for its mountains, lakes, wildlife, and beautiful views, but many have no idea that the remains of an old industrial community can also be found there. Bankhead was a coal mining town established in the early 1900s. Coal was extremely important at the time, especially for the railways, and the mountains around Bankhead contained deposits worth mining. A community grew around the operation, and hundreds of people came to live there. Houses, businesses, community buildings, and industrial structures appeared beneath the mountains. For the families living in Bankhead, this was not an abandoned place or a historical attraction. It was simply home. Children grew up there while miners went underground each day to perform dangerous and exhausting work. Bankhead's future, however, was tied completely to coal. Problems developed between the workers and the mining company, and the mine eventually shut down in 1922. Once the jobs disappeared, the town had little chance of surviving. Residents moved elsewhere, some buildings were removed or relocated, and other structures slowly fell apart. Over the following decades, the forest began covering what remained. Today, visitors can still see old foundations, pieces of mining equipment, and other remains from the community, but much of Bankhead has disappeared into the landscape. Number 4 is Phoenix, British Columbia. High in the mountains of southern British Columbia once stood a city with one of the most fitting names imaginable, Phoenix. During the mining boom of the late 1800s and early 1900s, copper and gold brought thousands of people into this mountainous region. Phoenix grew rapidly and became much more than a rough mining camp. At its height, the community had hotels, stores, churches, entertainment, and even an opera house. Imagine arriving there more than a century ago. Instead of an empty mountain landscape, you would have found busy streets filled with miners, business owners, families, horses, wagons, and people searching for opportunity. Buildings stood close together, businesses competed for customers, and almost everyone believed the valuable minerals in the surrounding mountains would continue supporting the community. But mining towns can grow faster than almost any other kind of settlement, and they can disappear just as quickly. Phoenix existed because valuable ore was being removed from the ground. Once the mining industry declined and major operations stopped in 1919, the city's reason for existing disappeared with them. Residents began leaving, businesses closed, and many buildings were dismantled or moved to other communities. A place that had once been home to thousands became almost empty. Later, mining activity returned to the area, changing the landscape even further, and much of the original town disappeared. Today, only limited remains and historical markers remind visitors that a busy community once stood there. Number 3 is Sandon, British Columbia. Deep inside a narrow mountain valley in British Columbia is Sandon, one of the province's best-known historic mining settlements. Its story began during the silver rush of the 1890s, when valuable discoveries brought prospectors, miners, business owners, and workers rushing into the area. Sandon grew incredibly quickly. Hotels, stores, saloons, homes, and other buildings crowded into the narrow valley, and thousands of people passed through the community during its busiest period. For such a remote mountain town, Sandon was surprisingly advanced. It had electricity early in its history, and the wealth created by nearby silver mines turned it into an important center for the surrounding mining district. At night, instead of a dark and empty valley, there would have been lights glowing from buildings while miners and travelers filled hotels and businesses. But Sandon's dramatic mountain location also created serious problems. There was very little flat land, and the community was squeezed between steep slopes. Fires damaged the town, flooding caused destruction, and changes in the mining industry slowly reduced the number of people living there. Unlike some ghost towns, Sandon did not disappear after one single event. It declined through a series of disasters and economic changes. Buildings were destroyed, businesses closed, and residents moved away. Today, however, parts of Sandon still survive, including historic structures, old machinery, and reminders of its mining past. That makes the place especially interesting because you can compare what remains with photographs of the crowded town that once occupied the valley. Number 2 is Ocean Falls, British Columbia. On British Columbia's remote central coast sits a place where the weather itself seems perfect for an abandoned town story. Ocean Falls is surrounded by mountains, thick forest, dark water, mist, and enormous amounts of rain. It is important to say that Ocean Falls is not completely abandoned. A small community remains there today. But compared with the town at its peak, modern Ocean Falls is only a fraction of what it once was. The community grew around a large pulp and paper mill, and because the location was so isolated, a proper company town had to be created for workers and their families. Thousands of people eventually lived there. Ocean Falls had schools, stores, houses, recreational facilities, and the normal routines of a busy community. Children walked to school, workers headed to the mill, families visited neighbors, and generations of residents created memories in a place that must have seemed permanent. The problem was that almost the entire community depended on the mill. When the operation struggled and eventually closed in 1980, Ocean Falls lost the economic engine that had kept thousands of residents there. People moved away in huge numbers, homes and other structures became empty, and parts of the town were left behind. The coastal climate then began doing what it does extremely well, breaking things down. Heavy rain, moisture, wind, and vegetation slowly attacked abandoned structures. Moss appeared, wood began to rot, and plants grew around places that had once been part of everyday life. This gives Ocean Falls a very different feeling from an abandoned town in a dry desert. Here, the wilderness feels alive. The forest is always pushing closer, rain falls across aging buildings, and mist can hide the mountains surrounding the settlement. Number 1 is Port Radium, Northwest Territories. For our final location, we travel much farther north, into a landscape so remote that the abandoned settlement feels almost separated from the rest of the world. On the eastern shore of Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories are the remains of Port Radium, a mining settlement with a history far more serious than its lonely location might suggest. Mining began in the area during the 1930s after valuable mineral deposits were discovered. At first, radium was an important target, but uranium later became extremely valuable. During the Second World War, uranium from this region became connected to the growing nuclear industry and the Manhattan Project. Suddenly, material coming out of a mine beside a remote northern Canadian lake was linked to events that would change world history. Life at Port Radium was extremely isolated. The settlement was surrounded by enormous stretches of northern wilderness, and moving workers, equipment, food, and/or through this environment required major effort. Winters were long and severe, transportation was difficult, and almost every part of life depended on the mining operation. Indigenous people from the region, including Dean workers, also played a role in transporting or from the mine. Over the years, serious concerns developed about the health and environmental effects connected with uranium mining and the handling of radioactive material. Mining at Port Radium happened during different periods before finally ending, leaving behind contaminated areas that later required cleanup work. The history of the site is therefore not simply a ghost town story. It also involves indigenous communities, industrial pollution, dangerous materials, and the enormous human cost that can be hidden behind valuable natural resources. Today, the wilderness around Great Bear Lake feels far removed from the global events once connected to Port Radium. The workers are gone, the mining activity has ended, and much of what once made the settlement important has disappeared. Canada's wilderness is filled with places like these, communities that once seemed permanent but eventually lost the reason they existed. Maybe that is the real reason abandoned places are so fascinating. An empty building is never just an empty building. At some point, somebody unlocked its door every morning. Someone looked through its windows. Someone walked home along the road outside. People worked there, raised children there, argued there, celebrated there, and probably believed the community around them would continue long after they were gone. But nature works on a different timeline. So, out of these 7 forgotten places, which one would you most want to see in person? And if you arrived there just before sunset, Knowing you had to spend the entire night alone among the empty buildings, would you stay? Or would you leave before it got dark? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy discovering abandoned towns, forgotten settlements, and strange places hidden far from the modern world, subscribe to the channel because there are many more forgotten places waiting to be explored.